death was there was a documentary done by a British journalist, John Blair is his name, and they interviewed my grandmother. The documentary was done actually for the movie Schindler's List, and there was some of people of the past, like my grandmother, but also, for example, the wife of Oskar Schindler, were interviewed. They wanted to collect the voices, their statements. And after he left the apartment, my grandmother took an overdose of sleeping pills and killed herself. To find out was very difficult. Now to live with it is okay, because a long time passed and I came to terms with the fact. Today I think that yes, it is a big responsibility, but it's not a burden anymore. My grandfather was a war criminal. He's known to millions of people because he was depicted in the movie Schindler's List, but he was not a movie character. I mean, he was a real person, and he was put on trial in Poland after the war. He was convicted of the murder of thousands of people, and he was hanged after the war in 1946, very close to the former concentration camp in Płaszów. My grandmother was a woman that met my grandfather while she was working for Oskar Schindler. He introduced her to him, and she was smitten by my grandfather, my biological grandfather, from the very beginning, and they lived together in Płaszów. And even after the war, my grandmother still, she loved him very much. She took on his name, although they haven't been married, but she was more, I would say, like she was sort of his wife. Płaszów is a concentration camp. It's a concentration camp that was run by my grandfather, and my grandmother and my grandfather stayed there for a period of, I think, several years together. Monika Hertwig is my biological mother. She married, and this is her married, the name that she took on when she was married, but she's also she was born as Monika Göth, and she's the daughter of Ruth Irene and of Amon. Yes, she's my biological mother. She gave me up for adoption, but we were in contact for the first years of my life. She gave me to an orphanage when I was 4 weeks old, but we stayed in contact, and only when I was 7 years old we lost contact, because I was adopted by a white German family, and thereafter I haven't seen her for many, many years. But until 7 years we stayed in contact. She lives in Germany. She was born in Germany. He is also living in Germany. He was a student when he came to Germany, and I will talk about it a bit more later on when we talk about the family structure. Actually, my biological parents met in the household of my grandmother. He came as a student to Germany, and then he went back to Nigeria for a while, but today he's living in Germany. He's married. He's married to a German teacher, and they have more kids. In my mid-20s, I was never really interested in my father, maybe because as a child I grew up with the knowledge of who my biological mother and grandmother was. But my father, I only knew his name because the name was in my birth certificate, and somehow, maybe because I never met him as a child, I wasn't ever interested in getting to know him. Only when I was 20 and I started a psychoanalysis, I suffered depression for a while, I became interested in getting to know more about the paternal side, about my whole biological family. And then I was in my mid-20s, we met each other briefly. As I said, I came to the orphanage when I was very small, 4 weeks old, and I stayed in the orphanage until I was 3. It was an orphanage actually for babies. So when I was 3, I had to leave the orphanage, and one tried to find foster families for the kids in the orphanage. And I was lucky because Gerhard and Inge Siever, they were looking for a child, and somehow I came into the family. I stayed there as a foster child for 3 years, and when I was 7, they adopted me. And this was also the moment when cuts with my mother, my biological mother, were ties with my biological mother were cut. It's a bit complicated, but I want to add it. My parents separated before I was born, and my mother, she married a man who was abusive. So she was in an abusive relationship, and one of the reasons why my adoptive parents decided to cut ties was that it was simply not a safe and good environment. The circumstances were really difficult. So they wanted that I have a quiet and healthy childhood, and this was the reason why they cut ties. I met him in Germany, and I met him due to my work. It was actually my boss. So, classical story, we fell in love, and today we have 2 beautiful children. I try not to give too much information just for security reasons, and also I want them to stay incognito, so when they're older they can decide for themselves whether they want to share their story with the public. But I can tell you that they are in school in Germany. They are in the beginning of their high school education. I don't know which grade it is here in the US. Yeah, in Germany, in Hamburg, but I'm traveling a lot, so I would say I live all over the world. It was a decision that I did not make immediately after I found out who my biological grandfather was. It was something that I decided over a long period. When I myself understood more, I thought that what happened to me is such an extraordinary story, and it's a story that one needs to share. And this was one of the main reasons why I decided to write it down and to share it with the public. But there was another reason. The reason was that I came across a quote by Bettina Göring. And Bettina Göring is the grandniece of Göring. Göring was the chief commander of the Air Force, of the German Air Force during the Nazi era. And she and her brother both decided to sterilize themselves. And when I read this, I was stunned, because I thought this is so utterly wrong. So I thought it's important to set a different and to set a positive example, because you yourself decide who you want to be. You know, it's not something that is connected to genes. So this was one of the major reasons why I decided to write the book. The title was Amon, but the subtitle was always "My grandfather would have shot me." I think this was one of the reasons that it's for the US market they decided to do it, because the name Amon is not so known. I myself preferred Amon because, first of all, it's more a literal name, more like literature, and the book is a non-fiction book, but for me it is it's a book like more in the belletristic field. But the reason why we decided in Germany to publish it was Amon. The name is so striking because in our family, names play a very, very important role. And when you noticed, the name of my mother is Monica, and the nickname of my grandfather, my biological grandfather, was Moni. And there are some other aspects. For example, the name is a Jewish name. Also, the name of my grandmother is a biblical name. And there's another point, because I have a half sister, and she gave the name Amon, not only the name Amon, also a Jewish name, but a combination of 2 names, to her son. So it shows that the family history is transmitted into the next generation, into the 4th generation. All these reasons were for me so striking that I thought Amon is the right title. But when you want to sell a book, you also have to look at the market, and for me it's important to spread the message. So if this message is spread with this title, I'm fine with it. And the title is also interesting because the new title, My grandfather would have shot me, because it makes, when you look at me, you see the color of my skin. I'm black, so First thing, the title is because I look so differently. But what is more important is the inside. And when you read the book, you will see that my character is very different. And this is also why I think the new title is a good decision. I always sticked out. You know, when I grew up in a neighborhood in Germany where I was the only black child. So for me, being someone who is not average is so normal. When I walk around in the street, I don't notice anymore that people look at me. It's funny because my husband, he's also very tall, but only when I'm in a surrounding, for example, in Asia, where people are very small, and it's really intense that people look at us, I notice it. But normally, no, I'm so used to it. We would see a tremendously cruel person, a person who was, he was capable of, he had dogs, he had 2 dogs, he called them Ralph and Rolf, and he trained them to tear human apart. I think this sums it up really good. He was a person who there was a pleasure that he felt when he killed people, and this is something that when you're normal, if you don't have this aspect in your personality, it is very, very difficult to grasp. And I remember in the very beginning, when I discovered who my biological grandfather was, this aspect of his personality, the cruelty, was one of the facts that was most difficult for me to somehow come to terms with, because it's something that is so far from what you can imagine how people can be. Maybe, you know, when we have the political situation of today, and I was just thinking about ISIS people, you know, who slaughter other people, then it somehow gets normal. But this is not normal, you know. This is something that you can't treat people like this. There's something, I think, within a person or within yourself that should be. There's a humanity, you know. This is an aspect that when you look at the Nazi era, and my grandfather just got lost. He was put on trial actually by the Polish government. He was not at the Nuremberg trial. He was extradited to Poland. He was extradited together with the commandant of Auschwitz, with Höss. And there's an interesting detail what I read. When they arrived in Poland, they wanted to stone Amon Göth. You would imagine that they want to stone Höss because Höss is the one who's more known. But probably because of the cruelty, the way he really shoot people, he himself killed people, that the mass wanted to stone him. I saw the execution just hours after I discovered the biography about my mother in the library, so I was already in shock. And when I saw the execution for the first time, I did not expect that it would not work out, because this is something that is so surreal. And I remember myself sitting in front of the TV, and though I didn't know whether to cry or to laugh. Not to cry because of I was sad, but this is something that was it was just not real. Interestingly, I read that today, I don't know, maybe this is just something that is invented, but historians, they try to figure out whether this was really my grandfather, and some say it was someone else. It was, I think his name is Ludwig Fischer. I did some research. I don't know, maybe it's just a theory that is not right. I always, when I watched it, I thought it was my grandfather, my biological grandfather. Well, someone asked me whether I think that he deserved to be hanged. It's a very difficult question. I think he did so much evil, so he needed a punishment. I am against the death penalty. I'm a person who truly believes that the death penalty is something that you have to be very careful, because if you make a mistake, so you can't change it. I think my grandfather deserved the highest punishment that you can get. thousands, but also if you look at the trial of my grandfather, he was put on trial for thousands of Jews, but he also was, for example, involved in the eviction of the ghetto in Krakow. So I don't know how you can sum it up. And I also, I think the number is not relevant, because it's too many anyhow. It's thousands, but I can't give you an exact number. I don't know. When you look at the Nazi era, there was a very interesting experiment that was done actually here in the United States after the war, the Milgram experiment. And there one tried to find out why people treat other people the way they treated it in the Nazi era. I think it was not only the Jews. I mean, there were also other people who were killed, people who did not somehow had the ideology, the Nazi ideology. It was also the gypsies, for example, but especially the Jews. I think the system, but because the system said so, people followed the authority, and there are a lot of people who did not reflect. They were just following the authority. And for example, if you look at my grandmother must have been an anti-Semite. I mean, she lived in Płaszów, she lived with my grandfather, she supported the system. But after the war, I told you, my parents met in the household of my grandmother. My grandmother somehow adopted a different point of view. So it is so weird. I can't give you an answer why that happened. My mom is a difficult person. I mean, she's very typical for the second generation. My mother was always haunted by the past, and I think because it was her father, it was very, very difficult for her to separate. And if you look at her appearance, the photos that we've seen now, they show her, she looks a bit happier than the other pictures and the way I somehow perceive her. But she has, you see, on her, like she go and walks a bit like this, like the weight is on her shoulder, and she can't somehow leave the past behind. I think because it's the father and the identification with the parents for everyone, if you look at psychology, is so strong. She could never somehow find her own life. She is haunted by the past until today, and this is typical for the second generation. There's another famous example. It's Niklas Frank. I don't know whether you heard about him. He's the son of Hans Frank, who was the deputy of Hitler in occupied Poland. And he has a photo of his father. He was also hanged with a broken neck in his wallet. And he looks at it, he says, every day. So they go on and they can't leave the past behind, but they live with it. They feel guilty very often. And yeah, this is something that I think is a problem for the second generation, and I also think it's a bit a problem of my mother. For me, the name Goeth, I didn't have a relationship to the name Goeth, because it was just, for me, it was a random name. When I found out about who my mother was, about the family past, this was the first time that I understood that Goeth was a name that was connected to Amon Göth, to the Nazi past. So I don't, have this feeling. I think that's when I watched the video, I noticed something. Katrin Himmler, she's married actually to a Jewish guy today. Those are the descendants of perpetrators who knew from the very beginning about their family's past. And for me, it is very different, because I found out by coincidence. And I had a life before, and I also had a strong identity before. So I never only identified myself by being a Goeth, the granddaughter of Amon Goeth. I was more identified myself with being Jennifer, I would say. The second name I changed. I changed because of the adoption. I changed it because of my marriage. I was always Jennifer, and therefore I think it is far more, or it's easier for me, or it was easier for me in the long run to find my own identity. For all these people who grow up with their heritage, with the difficult heritage, it was almost impossible to leave the past behind. And if I say to leave the past behind, it doesn't mean that I forget, but I want to set a different example insofar that I think, just if you look back, it doesn't help anyone. The last word of my book is hope, because I think you have to look forward. And in my personal case, for example, I have 2 children, and I never had a real mother myself. So when I was so depressed, I couldn't be a good mother to them. And this is one of the reasons why I decided, no, I have to go in a different direction. And what I did was I traveled to Krakow. And in Krakow, the former concentration camp is not existing anymore. What you have there today, there's only a statue, a memorial where you can go. And when I understood that I have to leave the past behind, but I don't want to forget, I felt that it would be a good thing to lay there flowers, to have a symbolic act somehow to go on with my life, but not to forget and somehow honor the victims, but to go on and live in the future and try to see what I can do with my story and somehow turn it around, make something positive out of it. It happened on a sunny day in August. And
what city?
It was in Hamburg. It's still my hometown. It was a an ordinary day. I didn't suspect anything. In the morning I got up and my kids were much younger then. I drove them to preschool. And I was in the library. It's a huge library with thousands of books, and I was there already for a while, maybe half an hour, looking for books. I was in the psychology department. This is also interesting because it was not in the history department. And suddenly I saw a book with a red cover that grabbed my attention. So I just could read the spine, and on the spine there was the title, and it said, "I have to love my father, don't I?" And there was the name of the author. It was a journalist. I didn't know the name. His name was Matthias Kessler. I took the book out of the shelf and I started, at first I looked at the cover quickly, and there was a small photograph, a black and white photograph of a woman, a portrait, and then there was a subtitle, and it said, "The life story of Monika Goeth, daughter of the concentration camp commander of Schindler's List." And suddenly, there was a spark of suspicion, because Goeth, I knew the name Goeth, but still, it was too early. I started leaving to the book, and first very slowly, but then fast and faster. The book contained text, but also photograph, and there was one photograph that reminded me of my mother. It was a woman with dark hair, and there was another picture, and this was actually even a picture that was it was a picture of a woman in a flowery dress, and I had one single picture of my grandmother for all these years that I kept, and the woman on the photo had the exact same dress, and under the photo there was a caption, and it said Ruth Irene. And then I continued, I skimmed the book, and in the end there was a summarization of biographical details, the name of the woman, the birth date, where she was born, and so on and so forth. And at this very moment I understood that it was not a random book that I was holding in the hand.
Let's go back to the chart we have of how everybody is connected. And the picture.
I know as a child, she and my mother, they would visit me in the orphanage, or I would visit them at their house. Not often, sporadically, but I've seen her as a child. And this is how I knew her. And I only had very good, fond memories of her. Due to the fact that my mother was in an abusive relationship, she was also someone, as a child, I did not only like her, but she also provided me with safety. Maybe this also strengthened the bond. So when I discovered that she was not only my grandmother, the person that I knew as a child until I was 7, but also a woman who was capable of living outside a concentration camp with a man as sadistic as Amon Göth, this was a major problem for me. It somehow really plunged me into a crisis because I couldn't bring these two aspects of her personality together. I think, well, two reasons. One reason was she was really, really sick. She had a lung disease and she knew that she would die quite soon. But what might have triggered her death was there was a documentary done by a British journalist, John Blair is his name, and they interviewed my grandmother. The documentary was done actually for the movie Schindler's List, and there was some of people of the past, like my grandmother, but also, for example, the wife of Oskar Schindler, were interviewed. They wanted to collect the voices, the statements. And John Blair interviewed my grandmother, and after he left the apartment, my grandmother took an overdose of sleeping pills and killed herself. She left a suicide note, and when I found out, I so desperately wanted to get a transcript of the interview the journalist did, because in the suicide notes he said nothing about the war, about the past, and I thought, I really hoped that at the very end there was some kind of regret, or that she understood, what she did, what was happening. No, but she didn't. Not one word. She was really unrepentant. Different than my grandfather, but unrepentant in the end. But I met her daughter by coincidence. I had a reading event close to New York, and she was in the audience. I didn't know. I never contacted Helen because I didn't want to interfere with my mother. I thought, maybe she doesn't feel comfortable with it. I always wanted to meet her, but so I was really excited when she was in the audience. She asked me a question, and hopefully I will meet Helen in the future. I have an event scheduled where she might attend. It's going to be really, really interesting. I wanted to say something about the video because what she said about my grandmother, I think that doing nothing also makes you guilty. It is, when you have a car accident, to give you a different example, and you just drove by and you don't help, this is a criminal act. She was a maid in the household of my biological grandfather, and she lived in the house. In the movie Inheritance, that shows the encounter between my mother and Helen, there's a scene where she's standing in the house, and she had to work for my grandfather, and she was in constant fear because every day could have been the last day of her life. I think the relationship they had was she was the servant and had to obey to the rules. Both lived in the house. They were both Jewish, yes. I don't know, I think in the movie Schindler's List by Steven Spielberg, there's a scene, that he somehow approached one of the housekeepers also in an intimate way. One says that this was more fiction than reality. I don't know. I think he didn't have really a relationship because he was simply not capable of seeing them as a true human being. He saw them as people who he could treat the way he wanted to do so. And this is also the testimony that Helen gave. She was treated very, very, very badly by both. By my grandmother, by closing her eyes, and by my biological grandfather, who would beat her down the stairs. And I mean, to live with constant fear, this is something, you can't imagine. This is something so cruel, even if you don't shoot someone. The circumstances in the house were beyond what you can, I think, you want to imagine.
When did you first see Schindler's List?
I saw the movie first in Israel, ironically, because I have a very special bond with Israel and the Jewish people without knowing about my family's past. When I was younger, when I was in the beginning of my 20s, I moved to Israel and I lived there. I lived there for a couple of years. I speak fluent Hebrew, and I studied Middle Eastern politics and history in Israel. So I saw the movie I had a shared flat, an apartment with a roommate, and I saw the movie in Israel a bit later than the others. It was already out for a while. So I have heard some comments about the movie, and I saw it in my flat. I thought it was very moving. The first time that she's seen the movie, I read that she knew who her father was always, but she thought that her father was someone who was, she didn't know really what he was doing. Then she got more and more information. First, when she was 11 years old, later she got information by a Jewish inmate of Płaszów, the concentration camp. But seeing the movie for the first time plunged her into an enormous crisis, because it's different when you read something or if you hear something. The movie is very, or people say it's very close to reality. Then she, I think for the first time, she really realized what happened, what kind of person he was. I shared with him that I wrote a book a couple of weeks before the book came out. As I said, we had not been in contact for a long time. I saw him for the first time when I was in my mid-20s. Then there was a period where we had no contact. And then we reconnected, because for me it was so important that he wouldn't find out by coincidence that I tell him, you know, I wrote a book, and that he doesn't find out by himself. We didn't talk a lot about the past, because this time with my father, I didn't want to make the same mistake that I did with my mother. I really wanted to concentrate our relationship on the present. I want to get to know my father. I want to get to know his side, also the Nigerian side. I wanted to know more about how he grew up. So it's not something that we constantly talk about. I think that, yes, he thinks about it, and he's a very educated man, but it's not something that is a major part of our relationship. Now very often, because I'm in the public, I talk about the book, I talk about my story. It is so different to the first years, because after I found out about the book, I was unable to speak about it. And now you think it is easy. It is easy because such a long time passed. But you have to know that after I found out about the secret, the toxic family secret, for the first half year I didn't talk to anyone. I talked to my husband and to my therapist. After half a year, I first talked to my adoptive parents. After 1.5 years, I first talked to my biological mother. After more than 2 years, I shared the secret with my Jewish friends. And now 7 years passed. So until the book was published, until I was the first time in the media, I think there were 10 or 12 people I ever talked about it. It was received, the book was received very well. When I made the decision to go public, then I knew I can't go back, and I tried to share everything in this aspect of my life. There are a lot of different aspects that I keep private. For example, the age of my children, stuff like this. But I want people really to understand what happened. I want them somehow to go with me and understand the conflict. And since I think this is done in a way that people can identify, find themselves in the book, the reception was very, very good. And in Germany, the subject or the topic of Nazism is something that is it's such a part of German identity. It is in school. It's mandatory. We are educated about the Holocaust. That even by the educational system now, I was approached because they want to use the book in schools. So I think this is wonderful. Well, because you never know. You know, there are people out there. I was in the beginning, when I went public for the first time, I didn't know also for example, from the white wing or from white part, what would happen. You know, in Germany, we have a problem with neo-Nazis. And I just, didn't want to take any risk. Yes, I tried to. When you, I just turned the question back. Did you ever yourself feel like you have a day that is a bad day, yes. Feel like there's something wrong. But depression is when it's not a day, it's not a week, it can last for months. And I described it once with a cloud. It's like the cloud comes, and it's a cloud that will not disappear, and it's a dark cloud. And somehow you're not able to function, you're not able to get up. In my case, I wanted to sleep. I wanted to sleep so badly. But depression can also have very different symptoms. Depression often leads to addiction, you know, to drug abuse or stuff like this. So I suffered depression not only, I think, because of this toxic family circuit, also because of the early deprivation. Because when you are given up in such an early age, this is difficult for a child. But today I overcome the depression, and I think it's due to the fact that the toxic power of the family secret was lifted. Because if you have something that you don't know, it is still there. It exists on a subconscious level, and this is because this ultimately will always lead to some depressive elements in your personality, because you don't find yourself, you can't find your true inner self, and you need to have a feeling of who you are for everyone. This is not just true for me. Identity, to find your own self, to have a true feeling of your identity is crucial for everyone. Depressed, I think a few years ago I had a bad day syndrome, you know, after I found the book. It was 7 years ago, and then I had a period where I had to recover. Today I would say I don't suffer depression anymore, because I'm not afraid that the dark cloud would come back, because there's nothing unsolved. You know, I compared it once with a puzzle. My problem was, and again, I want to speak more general. If you have in your life a lot of pieces of, like in a puzzle, you need somehow a framework, or a frame where you can put it, because otherwise you're not stable. And today I have the frame, and when you have a frame and you can put in the pieces, you're not afraid that everything breaks down. It's not like a house that is built on sand, you know, you just take out one brick and everything falls into pieces. No, if you have a proper structure, if you have a fundament, then you have a good chance that depression will not come back. Well, I'm not a religious person, but I always say I'm a believer, and I'm a true believer. I think that when you look at the story, you can ask yourself, was this coincident or was it faith? And I also ask myself, for example, why did I go to Israel? Why did I choose from so many options to live and study in Israel? Why do I speak Hebrew? I can't give an answer, because it always depends how you look at life. If you look at life backwards, then you see, you know, there is something that somehow holds things together. If you look at it into the future, you make a decision without knowing why you do it. So I think there is a higher power that holds everything together. But yeah, I'm a believer, but I'm a religious person. I think with religion, the problem is if you are too extremist, you know, then sometimes religion can divide people. And this is something that I think is a danger for our society today. I mean, we see it. He grew up in a Catholic household, but it was not a household, you know, where they practiced religion on a daily basis. In Historia של מזרח התיכון means a history of Middle Eastern and African history. And no, I've been to Africa several times. Nigeria is very dangerous. I was now supposed to go, but my the family comes from the Delta, and even the embassy, they said, you know, it's maybe not such a good idea to travel there. I will go there if the period is more quiet, but I've been to Tanzania, I've been to South Africa, I've been to a couple of places. I didn't tell them for a long time. As I said, it took me more than 2 years until I could open up. Not because I was afraid that they would reject me, you know. I was so afraid what my revelation would trigger within their families, because I lived and studied in Israel, so I have I think a profound understanding somehow of what's going on, and a bit about the Jewish soul. I said I'm not a religious, but I'm a believer, and I think every religion is there, and so I have a lot of knowledge about the Jewish religion and about what happened in the families of my friends, but I didn't know exactly where they lost, for example, their relatives. So I was scared. Maybe some had lost relatives even in Płaszów. So how could how would they accept it? Not accept me, but accept the fact. So eventually I understood that although I was so scared, I had to share it, because this is what friendship is about. If you have a friend, you share everything, or you try to share the important things in your life. And I told them, and it was heartbreaking, because what happened was they were full of empathy, and they did not cry for themselves or for their families, they cried for me. There's a reason why I only wrote why. I will not tell it to you now, I will tell it to you afterwards, but I can say it's a family member that is very dear to me. I think this was in connection to my early childhood experiences. The man my mother married after she separated from my biological father was abusive, and he had a problem with alcohol, so yes, this reminded me a lot of what I experienced in my childhood. Because people invite me, and readers write me, and people talk to me, and they say it is good that you share the story, share it with a wider audience. And I think the message should be spread, and it's not spread all over the world. So hopefully a lot of people will read the book, and maybe it triggers or changes something for them.